Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Code 2025. My name is David Holtz. I'm one of the organizers of the conference and very excited to have you all here for what is going to be an amazing 2 days of talks and discussions and interactions. This conference, we're super excited about the program. We once again had a record number of submissions. Over 230 abstracts were submitted to Code this year. So, if you are presenting either in a talk or a poster, you had extremely stiff competition this year, and you should be very proud to be part of the program because we're very excited for your work. I'm going to have a long list of logistics that I go through here, so bear with me. I know this is not the most exciting beginning of the conference, but I promise that everything after this will be more exciting. So first, one thing that's very exciting, would love to just thank our sponsors for the conference who make this possible. So the beautiful conference room that you're sitting in, the amazing food and drink that you'll be having throughout the course of the conference, we can thank them for that. So we have our gold sponsors who are Amazon, Eppo by Datadog, Meta, and Netflix. And then we'd also like to thank our silver sponsor, Booking.com. So we have the sponsor room right next door. You can go over there to interact with our sponsors, check out what they're up to. There's a QR code in the program for job opportunities. So if you're looking for a job and would like to learn more about jobs at Amazon, Eppo, Meta, Netflix, or Booking.com, I encourage you to check out that QR code. Would also like to thank the Technical Program Committee for Code. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, we had 235 submissions, I think, which is an incredible amount of research to read in a very short amount of time. So every year we have a Technical Program Committee that helps us quickly assess all of those submissions. And this year that program committee was Jennifer Allen, Madhav Kumar, Hannah Lee, House Lin, Alex Moring, Payman Shahidi, and Hongyi Tuye. So thank you to them for helping out with the planning of the conference. Would also like to thank my co-organizers of the conference, Sinan Aral, Dean Eccles, and John Horton, who have been helping to co-organize this conference for many years. And I think it's a testament to their work that the conference has grown in the way that it has. And finally, would like to thank our first ever LIFT committee for Code. So the idea behind the LIFT committee is that we wanted to involve experimentation leaders at member companies of the IDE here at MIT and Code sponsors. And the idea was that this group would help inform and solicit research on the most interesting topics in digital experimentation. So we had identified a few topics that we were interested in this year, for instance, experimentation with LLMs. And we have sessions on all of these focus areas that we had identified. So the LIFT committee did good work in identifying and helping us solicit submissions on these topics. So we'd love to thank James McQueen, Zoe Isherwood, Ryan Lucht, Hussam Nassif, Martin Tingley, and Travis Brooks for their work on the LIFT committee. Okay, so that's all with the thank yous. On to general announcements. So one thing to note is that we are recording all of the plenary sessions and panel discussions that are happening during the conference, and they are going to be posted on the IDE YouTube account at a later date. But we are not going to be posting any of the parallel talks or poster slam presentations that happen during the conference. So I guess if you're giving a plenary talk or asking a question during the plenary talks, be careful what you say if you're someone that needs to be careful about these things. But during the parallel sessions or poster slams, you do not need to worry. You can find a QR code on the back of your event badges to view select abstracts. That QR code is also up here on the screen. So if you see a talk and you're like, wow, that was so interesting, I'd love to learn more than I was able to learn during the 12-minute talk, I encourage you to check out that QR code. And if you are, tweeting or posting on Instagram or posting on TikTok about the conference, that would be really interesting for you to do. But also, if you're going to do it, you should use the event hashtag CodeCon25. A bit about the format of these plenary sessions. So all of them are going to happen in this room. That includes the fireside panel later today and the practitioners panel tomorrow. In these sessions, each speaker is going to have 25 minutes to present their work, and then they'll have 1 to 2 minutes to answer clarifying questions while we sort of transition from one speaker to another. After both speakers have presented, we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience with the remaining time. So I guess have those clarifying questions locked and loaded right after the talk if you have them, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end of both talks. Questions that kind of cut across both presentations are encouraged and welcomed. For all of these plenary sessions in the fireside panel, we ask that you please ask questions via a microphone. We'll have a couple of different people in the room with mics running around. And the idea here is that, as I mentioned earlier, these are going to be posted online, so we want future viewers to be able to hear the question that you're asking, as well as the answer. The parallel session flow. So all of the parallel sessions are going to happen in 3 breakout spaces. So we have Salon 3 and 4, which are on the 6th floor right below us. You can take the elevator if you wish, but there's also a stairwell right outside. And then some of the parallel sessions are also going to happen right here in what is termed the salon. The IDE staff is going to be in the foyer, so they can help to point you in the right direction if you get lost. And you can find the room locations for all the sessions on the agenda right next to the title of each parallel session. In those parallel sessions, as I briefly mentioned earlier, each parallel speaker is going to have 12 minutes to present your work. Similar to these plenary sessions, while we transition between speakers, we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. And then after everybody has spoken, we'll have all the speakers come up to the front, and we'll kind of welcome additional questions that people have. As I mentioned earlier, questions that cut across presentations are really great. So if you can figure out how to do that, that would be awesome. The session chairs in those sessions are going to be keeping time during the sessions. And in those rooms, especially I guess if you're in this salon, if you can ask a question with the microphone, that would be great. But I think especially in the smaller rooms, probably less vital. To anybody who is speaking, either here in a plenary session or in a parallel session, please report to the room at the very start of the break before your session is going to begin, just to check in with AV and also with the person who's chairing your session. The AV folks have all of your slides submitted if you're giving a talk, but if you did not submit those slides, or if you have a late-breaking change to your slides that you'd like to incorporate, please head to the folks at registration now to make sure that you are all set. In terms of poster presenter flow, so we're going to have 2 poster slam presentations. As I mentioned earlier, we had an astounding number of submissions, and so there's a ton of really amazing research that's being presented as a poster as opposed to a session. And so we're going to have 2 sessions to kind of allow people to promote that work before we have the poster sessions. Those are going to happen today and tomorrow during lunch. So today we'll have the presenters for posters 1 through 19 present, and then tomorrow we'll have the presenters for posters 20 through 40. In these SLAM sessions, each poster presenter is going to have 2 minutes to pitch their work. If you are one of these presenters, you can form a line up here at the front of the room in the order in which your paper appears in the agenda, and then you'll kind of come up here to the podium, as I have done now, and speak when it's your turn. After you speak, you'll exit the stage and make your way back to your seat. We're going to start that poster slam about 15 to 20 minutes into lunch on both days. So similar to the plenary or parallel sessions, if you are someone who's in this poster slam, right when that break begins, just kind of come to the front of the room and start forming that line. We're going to hopefully have time, or definitely have time, for everybody to grab lunch and bring it back to your seat during that poster slam. Finally, at the end of the day, both today and tomorrow, we're going to have receptions. So all of the posters will be on display both days, whether they're presented in today's slam or tomorrow's slam. All of the poster presenters should report to this room right here at the afternoon coffee breaks today, which are at 2:20 and 3:55, to pin your posters onto foam boards and set up easel. We here at Code provide the easels, foam boards, and thumbtacks. You just have to present or provide the poster. And so again, please report to, actually the room to my left, just next door, to set up that poster during the afternoon breaks today. And just to clarify once more, all posters will be displayed both today and tomorrow during the reception, regardless of which day you're going to present your poster during a poster slam. So if you're a presenter of a poster, be prepared to stand steadfast next to that poster and answer all of the questions that people have during these receptions. So that is the very long list of logistics. I apologize and thank you for listening to me. Hopefully that information was helpful to you. And if not, I promise you that at least some of it will be repeated multiple times over the course of these next 2 days. But now on to the fun stuff. So we have a number of plenary talks during the conference that we're really excited about. These are people that are doing really amazing, really exciting work. And so the first of these plenary sessions is going to happen right now. At Code, there's a long tradition of not doing lengthy intros where we list off these people's accolades and accomplishments, but I promise you all of them have many accolades and accomplishments. And so without further ado, let me introduce our first plenary speaker, Iavor Bojinov from Harvard Business School.
Hello, you guys can hear me? Perfect. Thank you for that long list of things that we need to pay attention to. I know I'm going to try to remember as much of it as possible. It's so great to be here. This is one of my favorite conferences, and I think I've been coming here for, I don't want to admit how long, but almost since the beginning of it. And it's such a pleasure to get to share some of the research that I've been working on over the past maybe even 10 years on switchback experiments and panel experiments. And so I wanted to use this time with all of you to just give you like a little bit of an overview of this class of experiments and share some of the latest advancements, because I know some people are very familiar with this work, some people aren't, and so I wanted to make sure that everyone walks away with an understanding of what this is and how they work. And so let me start off, and this is my, oh, there we go, it does work. This is, every single time I start these types of talks, I try to convince people in the audience that experimentation is important for organizations. I think judging by the fact you're here, I probably don't need to tell you that, but it is very central to most firms' operations. And specifically now it's getting even more important when it comes to the deployment of AI, because this is something that you really need to evaluate. And it's great that there's going to be all these talks on around how do you evaluate large language models, et cetera. Now, most companies, tech companies in particular, run thousands of these types of experiments, and we actually have an abundance of data now that shows that companies that run more experiments actually perform better in terms of revenue and whatever other metrics you care about. And so why is that? Well, if you look at it, there's basically sort of two reasons and maybe a third one, which is companies use experimentation to measure the treatment effect, and they also use it to mitigate risk. And so this is from a paper that we wrote with Soumya Gupta, who at the time was one of the tech leads of experimentation at Microsoft, and he plotted the return on investment, and as you can see, he got rid of the axis. But you can basically see that lots of ideas have positive effects, lots of ideas have negative effects, and some are somewhere in the middle. And so you can use experimentation to help you figure out which ideas are good, which ideas are bad, and to really get a deeper understanding of what is actually working for your customers. So I think you all know this. Now, over the past 10 years, essentially since this conference has been running, and I'm not trying to make any causal claims here, but there's been a lot of advancements in sort of the world of business experimentation, and they sort of fall into two buckets. The first one is really on the design side, where we've seen a growth in sort of what I call static design. So these are versions of A/B tests, maybe network-aware ones that try to balance groups or try to isolate interfering units. There's been a huge explosion of these types of experiments. There's been a lot of growth in adaptive experiments, so things like multi-amp bandits, phase releases, or some mixture of these. And the thing I'm going to talk a lot about today is these sort of within units, the switchback or their generalization, these panel experiments where you sort of change the treatment of a single unit over time. That's on the design side. We've also seen a lot of advancements on the analysis side, where there's been a ton of work on trying to really understand heterogeneous treatment effects, or try to do sequential testing and optional stopping, where you try to stop studies sort of before the predefined end date. And a lot of work on sort of long-term effects from short-term data, so trying to extrapolate those experiments, not just what's going to happen in this 2 weeks, but what's going to happen sort of 6 months down the line. And what's really interesting, actually, when I wrote this list was before I looked at the agenda, because the agenda wasn't out yet. And there's basically sessions that focus on each of these topics here. So you can really see how all of these topics are things that are really growing. Now, the thing, as I said, that I'm going to focus on is really these within unit or switchback or panel experiments. And so let me just give you some of the basics. So these are a class of experiments where you run them on a single experimental unit over time. And so for simplicity, let's assume there's just a treatment and a control. And we've got, similar to traditional A/B testing, where you have an assignment vector. Here we have an assignment path that basically tells you what are the sequence of treatment or controls that you're going to administer to your experimental unit. I'm come from Harvard, and so I'm going to talk about potential outcomes. And so we're going to assume that at every moment in time, there exists some potential outcome that is the function of the full assignment vector. So that means future treatments, past treatments, current treatments can affect the outcome, okay? Now, the thing we want to try to estimate in the setting is a version of the global average treatment effect that says, what if I was able to always give you treatment versus what if I was able to always give you control, and I'm going to average that across time. So that's what I really care about. And why do we care about this? Well, if we want to make a decision, that's typically the two states of the world, right? We're in the world where there's always control, and we want to see if we flip to the world of always treatment, if things are going to get better. So that's sort of our causal estimate. Now, the challenge here is that even if I assume no sort of the future treatments can't affect current outcomes, there's still this challenge of carryover effects where past treatments can affect the current outcomes. And this is essentially the sort of fundamental problem with switchback experiments, is these types of carryover effects. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would you use these experiments? Right? This seemed like really weird. You can just do A/B tests. We have lots of customers, so why don't we just do an A/B test? And I want to give you three places and sort of three functional patterns that I've seen where these types of experiments are really, really important. So the first one, and this was actually the first talk I gave at Code, was on this paper, way back when it was a working paper. And here, what we wanted to try to understand was we really wanted to estimate the treatment effect on a single unit. Here, the unit was basically, at a high level, we wanted to compare whether humans or algorithms were better executing large financial orders. And this was sort of in 2015, 2016, when algorithms still weren't as sophisticated. And the unit here was actually the market that they were experimenting on. And this was partnering with this hedge fund, and they basically would make these like financial orders very rapidly, and they would buy things, they would sell things. And the worry was that every time you gave it to a person or to an algorithm, that could have this sort of long-term knock-on effects. So if I gave it to a person, they did a really bad job, that could actually move the whole market, which would then influence sort of future decisions that I make. And so here we wanted to really understand for each market we were looking at, who was better, humans or algorithms? And so we ran this type of switchback experiment to try to really figure out the unit-level treatment effect. So that's one big class. It's like if we really care about individual level experiments. And by the way, there's actually a long history of this types of experiments in psychology. They're known as N of 1 trials. And there it was really about trying to figure out like what is the appropriate dosage for a person, or what is the appropriate treatment for a person. And so there's a whole history of that. So that's the first application. The second application, and I should have put Lyft, Uber, and all the other types of companies on the slide, but really it came maybe like 7, 8 years ago, was this idea that when you look at companies, let's take Uber as an example, and if you try to run an A/B test on the drivers on something sophisticated like the matching algorithm, well, if I just assign some people to the old matching algorithm and some people to a new matching algorithm, they would change their behavior. And so people in the treatment could interfere with people in the control in a complicated way. And so instead of us being able to sort of estimate what's the treatment effect of this new intervention, we would end up getting something really murky. And so the basic idea was, well, what if we just take all of the units that are in treatment, all of the units in a small geographical area like Boston, and what if we treat them all at the same time for some short period of time, and then we swap their treatments. And so this became a very standard method of evaluating ideas in these types of complex marketplaces. The third application, and this is one that I only recently learned about when we worked on a project with P&G, is essentially when you have a lack of control. So if you're P&G, if you don't know them, they make Tide, and basically half of the household goods, they make most of those things. And essentially, what they want to do is they want to evaluate if a new algorithm, like a new bidding algorithm, works well on Amazon. But Amazon doesn't actually let them go and run this really simple experiment because they don't let them randomize at the user level because they don't have control over that. And instead, they basically have to randomize over time. And so this has become a very standard method for them. And we worked with them, and I'll share some of the work that we did with them on sort of trying to come up with better designs. So hopefully this convinces you that this is actually a wide class of problems fall into this category of switchback experiments. Now, there are two practical challenges to dealing with. This first one I already mentioned, which is this carryover effects, which is past treatments affect current outcomes. And there's basically two strategies for this. One is to just focus on the short-term effects, and I'll get into the details of this in a moment. And the other one is just to ignore it. or to limit it through some sort of modeling assumptions. So that's essentially how you would handle carryover effects. And then the second challenge is really low statistical power. And you should be thinking, well, relative to what? Relative to a traditional A/B test, right? Typically, your power is a function of how many units you have. And if you're a tech company, when you run an A/B test, you have a ton of power because you have tons of customers. But with switchback experiments, the power is a function of how many times can you actually switch. And that's usually low. That's maybe 500, 600 times. And so what can you do? Well, there's two things you can do. One is you can come up with a very careful design, or you can try to incorporate some ML models to adjust for covariates and do variance reductions. And I'm going to sort of spend the rest of the talks zooming into each of these two buckets and giving you a sense of some of the latest work on this. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about why are carryover effects such a problem. So here, this is synthetic data. That's why it looks so pretty. But the problem is we care about this global average treatment effect, right, which is trying to compare the blue line to the red line and look at that difference. That's the hypothetical thing. Now, when we go out and actually run an experiment, we observe data that kind of sits between those two things. And this is, by the way, the best case scenario. And what you should very quickly see is that every single time we swap from treatment or control, that observation is really far from the curve that we care about. And so if we were to just do a naive difference in means based on the observed data, that's obviously going to be biased for this objective. Even if we try to adjust with like some sort of IPW, that's still going to be biased. And so what have people come up with? How have people tried to overcome this? As I mentioned, one is to just ignore it. There's a long history of ignoring carryover effects going back to sort of the earliest papers in this area. And what does that mean? It basically just means that after some short period of time, the system has stabilized, and it doesn't really matter what you did before that. And so if I was to draw you a picture, think of this as sort of a tree structure of the potential outcomes, right? So these are the potential outcomes at time 1, there's 2 of them. At time 2, there's 4 of them. At time 3, there's 8 of them, and so on and so forth. And so what is, and just to point out, so what we're trying to estimate is all of these differences, right? We're always trying to compare all or nothing, and we're trying to average it. When we limit the carryover effects, essentially what that says is that these guys are the same, these guys are the same, and these guys are the same. Essentially, what it's saying is that what happened over here doesn't matter. It's as if we were able to get replications of this experiment. And that allows us, because these things are the same, it allows us to then estimate this global average treatment effect, because we're basically saying there's no carryover effects. We get enough independent observations, and so everything works out quite nicely. So that's the first strategy. The second strategy is to say, look, the problem comes because you're trying to extrapolate. You're trying to take this like really, really granular short-term data, and you're trying to say, okay, what's going to happen in the long term if I have this all or nothing comparison? And so instead of saying that, you can say, well, what if I don't care about that? What if I just try to answer a simpler question of what happens if I give you 2 more treatments relative to 2 more controls, conditional on everything that's happened in the past? So that's sort of the alternative. These are these sort of short-term effects. And so if we come back to this picture, it begins in the same way. So we're trying to compare, treatment versus control. In time 2, we're trying to compare 2 treatments versus 2 controls. But after that, it's conditional on what happened in the first assignment. So for example, if we had observed treatment at time 1, we would try to compare these guys. So basically, we're asking the question of what happens if I give you a little bit more treatment relative to a little bit more control. If we had observed control, we would be comparing these guys here. And notice, this is very much connected to the previous picture that I showed you, because if I assume that there were no carryover effects, then this comparison is exactly the same as comparing the all or nothing, right? So these two things are actually very, very similar. And so in both cases, what's happened is that the way to actually estimate things the simplest way is to use like an IPW estimator that essentially throws away a little bit of data. And basically says, every time I switch, I'm going to just throw away like the first observation. And then I'm going to use the data after that, right? That gives the system a little bit of time to stabilize. And the properties of this estimator, well, one is like this is actually in practice what most companies do. They just burn a little bit of data, and then you do the comparison. But what's nice about this guy is that it's actually always unbiased for that short-term effect. And if there are no carryover effects, it does actually estimate the global average treatment effect. It can have large variance because we're doing this IPW, and so at every moment in time, it's kind of a terrible estimate, but when you average it, it should be okay. Maybe one quick point here, which is, now, suppose you didn't want to say that there were no carryover effects. You could come up with lighter assumptions that say, oh, I'm going to assume that this decays, for example, right? So if I look, the effect of prior treatments decays in some functional way. And if I had a model for the outcome, for example, if I use like a Bayesian structural time series model, I could actually figure out what that phi function is, and I could get a sense of what is the bias induced by using the short-term data to actually estimate the long-term data. And with this, you can actually come up with better designs that try to balance the bias that comes from estimating the long-term effects with the short-term data with the variance. So you can do a really nice bias variance trade-off here. Okay, so this is on the analysis. Let me spend a moment talking about the design of these types of switchback experiments. So what is a design? A design, and this is true not just in switchback, but in general, a design is basically a mapping from the assignment vector to some probability space with the property that it sums to 1, and that all the assignments are positive. The way we measure the quality of this is we basically look at its mean squared error, right? Is it doing a good job in terms of the variance, and is it giving me potentially unbiased estimates or estimates with low bias? In switchback experiments, there's a trade-off, which is if you sort of switch too often, you collect less data, but these designs tend to have less bias. If we switch very rarely, you have lots of data, but these designs can be really susceptible to sort of external shocks, and so can actually exhibit really high bias. And so what have we done? Well, we started working on this area for a while, and we wrote a paper trying to come up with what is sort of the minimax optimal design of regular switchback experiments. And the idea was that we would basically generalize like a Bernoulli design, so a coin flipping design. So at every moment in time, we could flip a coin, and then the question is, what is sort of the optimal frequency of you flipping a coin? And what we showed was that essentially, you could actually figure out when is the optimal time to randomize, and you can actually figure out what is the optimal assignment probability if you make no assumptions, and it turns out it's a half. What's really funny about this is it has amazing theoretical properties, but it sucks. And you should never do that. And it was great because my collaborator, Jinglong, was actually presenting this, and a PhD student at the time came up to him and was like, I'm pretty sure we can do better. Luckily, the paper was already accepted. And so we said, OK, great. And I hired him as a postdoc. And then we wrote, if someone comes to you and says, I can do better than you, you're like, yes, come here. And so we came up with a very simple fix for this, which is like this balanced switchback experiment, which basically says instead of doing a Bernoulli design, we'll do a completely randomized design. And so ensure we have 50% of the time treatment, 50% of the time control. And you can actually see just very simple simulation, you can see how this type of balanced design that ensures you have the same number of treatment as control units does much better. And of course, we know this from traditional experiments that in small samples, completely randomized designs perform better than Bernoulli's. We just had not really thought about it. We were like really chasing the theory there. Now, the challenge with both of these designs is that none of these actually use covariates or sort of historical data. And so over the past few years, we've been really trying to figure out how can we incorporate some of the more structure that we have. So when it comes to switchback experiments, you typically have a lot of historical data. Like this could be, say, your sales or the number of rides, et cetera. So you have a lot of this historical data, and this type of time series data exhibits both seasonal correlations and serial correlations. So for example, outcomes, August 23rd and 2 p.m. is going to be similar to August 24th at 2 p.m. and August 23rd at 3 to 4 p.m. So these are the serial and seasonal correlations. And the reason why this is useful is because if you sort of zoom into a day, the situation you want to avoid is basically putting the peaks and the troughs in the same treatment consistently, right? Now, the thing is, Theoretically, this isn't a problem. Like in theory, this isn't a problem because on average, across lots of experiments, it's fine. But that doesn't matter because what you care about is the experiment you're currently running, and you want to avoid the situation. And so the simplest thing you could do is basically say, hey, can we just do re-randomization, which is I randomize, I look at this assignment, I basically compare it to historical data and see if I have good balance. And so this is some historical data from P&G, and you can see how they have highs where they do most of their sales, and then lots of times where basically no one is buying anything. And you can kind of guess that's like the middle of the night in the US where not that many people are trying to buy Tide. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have good balance across sort of the top and the bottom. And you can think of this as basically excluding designs that are sort of extreme. And of course, in the paper, we make this much more formal. But the idea is it obviously works really well in practice because it gets rid of all of those edge cases. And you can see sort of compared to the Bernoulli and the completely randomized design, when you do re-randomization, you can sort of halve the variance very, very easily at almost no cost. And so when we wrote this paper, it worked really well for P&G, and then they were like, don't publish it for like a while because we don't want, we're like, okay, whatever. But in the meantime, we said, okay, can we actually be a little bit more systematic about this and try to be more rigorous? And so what we came up with is what we call this model-assisted design that basically says, let's look at the historical data, let's fit a model to it, and let's try to understand some of the patterns in it. So for example, here, if you look at this data, and I'll just do a proof by visualization, right, there's sort of these periodicity happens on a weekly basis. So like 6 to 7 a.m. across all of these days is kind of similar, 7 to 8 is kind of similar, 8 to 9 is kind of similar, 9 till 10 is similar, and so on and so forth. And so you can come up with a design that basically says, well, I want to have perfect balance across those periods of time. So I can take my, let's say here the example is with 4 days, I can put half of them in treatment, half of them in control, and then I can sequentially go and say, okay, half of these I'm going to flip over to treatment, half of them I'm going to sort of keep in the current period, and so on and so forth. And what this design does is it guarantees perfect balance. So this is very much inspired by what people have been doing in practice, which is these mirror designs where you sort of randomize 1 week and you mirror it. But here, this is just much more systematic and actually gives you a lot more control because there's a number of tuning parameters that control it. And so when you sort of compare this, you can see that it outperforms anything we've done in the past as well as anything that other people have done, which is kind of nice. So that's on the design. I want to finish just very briefly talking a little bit about inference, because there's been, maybe not so much in this room, but in operations, which is the community I've been hanging out with, there's been this push to come up with these amazing designs, but no one actually tells you how to do inference for them. And in fact, in most of them, you can't actually do inference because they're so complicated. None of the sort of the standard machinery we use applies to them. And so I want to spend a moment just telling you a little bit about inference. Now, it's super easy to test the sharp no hypothesis. This is like the Fisher sharp no of no treatment effect at any point in time. You can basically resample the assignment path, computer test statistic, and do that many, many times, and that gives you a null distribution. You can use that for hypothesis testing, and you can invert it to get confidence intervals. I hate when people say that because inverting it is actually really hard. More on that, if you grab me, I can tell you more about that later. But what you can also do is you can actually also get a design-based central limit theorem that basically allows you to build confidence intervals. A couple of notes here. Depending on the design, you may have different ways of having to prove these types of COTs, and there's a whole class of ways you can do it, either martingale theory or using some other tools. A couple of things to point out. If there are carryover effects, this isn't going to actually center on the thing you care about. Instead, it's going to center on this short-term treatment effect. And so even though you might care about the global average treatment effect, and you might assume that there are no carryover effects, if there are, what you are actually estimating unbiasedly is this short-term effect. So that's kind of nice because it gives us a little bit of robustness. So even if we're wrong, we kind of get a sense that in the short term, this is better, or in the short term, that is better. You can't do the extrapolation, but maybe that's actually good enough for us to make decisions. Of course, the variance, if you're used to this type of work, can't be directly estimated, but you can put an upper bound and you can use a plugin estimator for that. That's relatively easy. And you can actually do variance reduction essentially by using covariates. And you can think of it as using like an augmented IPW estimator where you have whatever ML model you want. You do sort of one-step time series forecasting. You residualize and do everything on the residuals. That works out fine. So that's inference. And then I did promise, actually, let me just mention this very, very quickly, which is, of course, you don't have to wait until the end. There's been a lot of work on sort of sequential testing, and we've got a paper on this as well. And the idea is instead of computing confidence intervals, you can compute confidence sequences, and you can use these to stop them. Of course, the price you pay is a slight increase in variance. I think there's a whole section focused on this type of talk today that you should definitely check out. The final thing to just very briefly mention is, of course, there's the generalization to panel experiments, which is what happens when you have multiple units. The generalization, if there's no population interference, is actually relatively easy, and you get the benefit of essentially much more power because you're seeing each person in treatment and control, and you can do asymptotics with N, T, or both. If there is interference, things become much more complicated, and we have some work in this area that basically says even if you have a little bit of interference in the spatial domain, you can essentially do better than doing like a single switchback experiment. You kind of want to do sort of local grouping and still allow for some interference. So you can make a lot of progress in this area. All right, let me finish and just say thank you. Hopefully this gives you a very brief overview of the world of switchback and panel experiments. And if you have any more questions, I have the easiest email, ib@hbs.edu, so feel free to ping me. But thank you so much, and I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yav. I think we have time for one question, maybe, if anybody out there in the audience has one. OK, that's fine, if not. All right, great. So thank you again, Yav. Yav will be back soon to answer your questions, so think of some in the intervening time. But in the meantime, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Emil Palikot from Northeastern University.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here, so many thanks for having me. Imagine you are recruiters, and your task is to hire a candidate for a highly attractive job. The job pays high salary, there are great benefits, the employer is awesome, so you really want to make an effort to find the best candidate. You post a job online, on LinkedIn, and after a couple of weeks, you realize that you received 10,000 applications. So now you have 10,000 cover letters, you have 10,000 resumes, you have 10,000 LinkedIn profiles. So how do you go about the problem of who should be invited for an interview at the company? This is tough for at least 4 reasons. First, just the sheer volume of applications means that you're not going to be able to carefully look at every single one of them. Second, you want to be objective and merit-based, but you know that you have some personal preferences, so you kind of want to keep that at bay. Then you work under time pressure, right? You have your hiring manager that is knocking on the door and telling you, we need that person to start yesterday, start scheduling the interviews. And last but not least, you kind of know that all the information you receive from the candidates have to be taken with a grain of salt. Right? You know that people tend to report experiences that they didn't really have on their resumes. They inflate their skills. So you have to be careful about that. And we kind of documented that all of those bottlenecks are real. Good news for you is that there is a new class of tools that you can use right now, which looks something like this. Oops. See if this will work.
Hey, I'm your AI interviewer. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing absolutely fantastic. Let's jump into it. I have some context on your background based on your LinkedIn. Can you tell me a bit about your experience at WDB at Berkeley?
Yeah, at WDB at Berkeley, I developed 2 full-stack web applications with my peers at Berkeley, and we mainly worked on React and Node.js as the tech stacks.
Nice. Can you explain to me what props are in React?
Yeah, props in React are a way for you to pass data from a parent component to a child component, giving the input data for that child component, which allows for efficient data flow from component to component within React.
This is an AI recruiter, and this is my co-author here trying to get a job as a front-end engineer. He actually didn't pass that interview. So what this gives you is you're going to get a report that looks like this for all the 10,000 people that applied. So you have the evaluation of the skills that you wanted to be evaluated here, Python, React, Next.js. There's the transcript. There's a recording, some more information about the candidate. And you can now use it to decide who gets the interview. So this looks great, very convenient for a recruiter, and that probably kind of explains a quick adoption of this technology where just a couple of years ago, almost nobody was going through this experience, while now we have tens of millions of people experiencing an AI interview. And the media started paying a lot of interest to this. The New York Times ran an article that pretty much tells you that next time you interview for a job, be prepared that you will be interviewed by an AI. So the question that I want to study here in this paper is whether this is just a gimmick that looks great, or is it a tool that will actually help a recruiter select the great candidate. So while we know that AI is effective in a number of spaces, from fraud detection to radiology, this feels a little bit different, right? Because there is a number of tasks that AI is performing at the same time. First, you have to generate an interview script, but then you have to talk to the person, right? You have to make the candidate feel kind of welcomed. You have to follow up after the responses. You have to adapt the interview. So this is pretty complicated. And then at the end of the day, you have to help the recruiter select the candidate. So whether this works, I'm going to look at this in 3 steps. First, show you some historical data where we have the AI grades, and then we have the decisions of a hiring manager, kind of a technical expert, about the same candidate. Then I'm going to show you an RCT with a software engineering position, and then talk about mechanisms. Throughout this whole talk, I want you to think about the following recruitment pipeline. First, we have candidates who apply. They send their application, and recruiters observe these applications. Recruiter's task is to select who gets an interview. And they select for interviews with hiring managers. Hiring managers in this context will be domain experts. So when you are hiring for a software engineering position, a hiring manager here will be a senior engineer or a staff engineer. And there could be several rounds of interviews with hiring managers that kind of collectively lead to a recommendation that we're going to give to a decision maker. We can call that person a VP. The AI interview will sit at kind of very beginning of this funnel. So it could be that the candidate applies, and the first thing that happens to that candidate is that they're going to receive an invitation for an AI interview. Great. The first analysis that I want to show you is in historical data, and I want to see whether the grades assigned by an AI interviewer will check out with a decision of a hiring manager. So here we have, data here comes from Micro One. This is a recruiting company. Kind of all data and all the analysis in this paper is done using the data from Micro One. So we had a little bit over 5,000 candidates who applied for 206 different job titles, most of them being jobs in the technology sector. So here the funnel was as what I showed you before. We had a candidate applying, participating in the AI interview. Then the recruiter observed those reports, and based on this, selected who gets to talk to a hiring manager. Hiring manager doesn't observe these reports, right? They just get an invitation in their calendar at a specific time, conduct a technical interview with this person for 30 minutes. So I want to see whether the grades given by AI here will predict well what will be the decision by the expert. I will do it by training two predictive models. I have first a baseline model where I have the outcome of the interview with the hiring manager, so yes or no on the candidate. I have information from the resume, and I have the candidate demographic. Then I have a richer model in which, in addition, I'm adding the AI grades. And I want to compare those two models in terms of their out-of-sample predictive performance. What I get is an ROC curves that look like this. So the blue one is the baseline model where we do not have the AI grades, and the green one is the model with AI scores. So this shows us that we are able to capture better the decision of a hiring manager if we start incorporating those AI grades. And this is particularly true in this kind of low false positive rates, which I think describes well a lot of recruiting situations, right? You have a lot of candidates who applied, but you kind of know that only a few of them would actually pass the interview with a hiring manager. And we see that the gap in performance of those two models is really high here at the very beginning. We can look at a specific position. Here, junior software engineer, the most common job we have in this data set, and estimate models in a similar way, and what we get is a very similar picture. A model with AI outperforms the model without it, and it does so quite substantially. In fact, the difference is quite striking, right? If you take this 10% false positive rate and you compare and you look at the baseline model, you see that you are able to capture only maybe 25% of the good candidates. If you start incorporating those AI grades, this goes up to 50%. So 1 in 2 good candidates out there would be captured if you start including this information. So this is great. The AI evaluations are similar to the decisions of hiring managers, but there's a big kind of caveat with this analysis, right? This is a selected sample of people that got to interview, because the recruiter observed those reports, and you had to be good enough to talk to the hiring manager. So kind of to go around this problem, we have carried out an experiment. So in this experiment, we used a position that was the actual job Micro One was hiring for a junior software engineer. This is a hot startup from San Francisco. It's a remote position. A lot of people want to work there. They pay really, really well. And after a couple of weeks, we received 37,000 applications. I was doing something like this for the first time, and I kind of came back to the recruiters in this company asking, is it a mistake? Did we have some bots that started applying, or what the heck is going on? And they were saying, no, that's what typically happens with our positions. And they told me that this isn't even close to the highest numbers that they received. This was great for us, and we could randomize these applicants into the treatment group, which would go through the AI pipeline, and we had a control group that participated in a conventional process. This is the experimental funnel. I'm going to kind of walk here in detail so that you can later on exactly understand what we are doing. So we had 37,000 applicants. We randomized 70% of them into the treatment group and 30% of them into the control group. The control group is a very standard process. They go straight into the applicant tracking system. There is some processing of those applications. An important thing that is being done in this applicant tracking system is that we are getting a thing called resume score, which is a keyword-based assessment of the fit of the candidate for a specific position. But this is very basic. So if a job requires Python and the candidate wrote Python on the resume, the score will go up. If the candidate wrote senior Python, it will go even higher. Then we have the treatment group, and that's around 26,000 people that were invited to participate in the AI interview. So 19,000 declined the invitation and didn't complete the interview. 6,000 completed and failed. So failing here means the following thing. We require the position to have proficiency in 3 skills, Python, React, and Node. And if the candidate wouldn't demonstrate that they have a sufficient proficiency in those 3 skills, they would fail. And we only had 287 candidates that completed and passed this interview. After that, in the second stage, we are having two groups of recruiters working separately but simultaneously. Each of these groups have a task of selecting 35 people that get to meet a hiring manager. So 35 people in control and 35 people in the treatment. And then for the 70 people, we observe the outcome of the interview with the hiring manager, and that's a yes or a no. The yes would mean that they get to meet even more senior person in the company. Important here is that hiring manager, so this final human interview stage, these guys do not know the pipeline that the candidate came from them. They just received an invitation and they were asked to perform a technical interview. So this is low power. We only have 70 people here. So to get a little bit more robustness, in addition to this, we collected LinkedIn profiles for 3,500 people. And the logic here is that those 37,000 people are looking for a job. Someone will find a job in this company, but probably others will find jobs in other firms on a similar position. So what we want to look at here is, finding a job as a software engineer elsewhere will also be a good outcome, so we want to count those as well. So the main result of this experiment is that AI-selected candidates are more likely to pass the hiring manager interview. Here on this first bar, it's the control group. So out of those candidates selected using a conventional process, 34% of them passed the interview with the hiring manager. In contrast, in the treatment group, 54% of candidates did so. So there is a 20 percentage points increase in the probability to pass this interview when you are selected through the AI process. We can start adjusting for covariates, but that basically doesn't really change. Looking at those LinkedIn outcomes, on these plots, I'm showing you the share of candidates in the treatment or control group that found a job. In this one on the right, we have these 35 people versus 35 in control. And you see that, again, there is a gap. So those candidates were not only more likely to participate, to have a successful interview within the Micro One company, but also to go elsewhere and find other jobs. And then to get some more statistical power, we are looking at the left plot on all those guys who passed the AI interview, and we are comparing them to the control group of candidates that received the highest possible resume score. And again, we are seeing that there is a difference in terms of probability of finding a job. So the AI here will not only find candidates that are more likely to pass the interview with a hiring manager, but will systematically find different types of people. So on this plot, I am showing you the average characteristics of people who are more likely to be interviewed when we are using AI, or less likely to be interviewed when we are using AI. What you can see is people who benefit have on average much fewer years of professional experience. They are on average younger, and at the last, they are less likely to have a graduate degree. We also looked here at the gender composition. It doesn't seem to move much. So what it shows us is that potentially recruiters have been really weighing heavily as signals of graduate degrees, of being in the industry for a long time, having more experience, while in AI, interviewer focus more on skills and weight less the other elements. All right, let's talk about mechanisms. This is the fun part. I'm pretty sure you are aware of the problem that people tend to systematically lie on their resumes. There's this one study here which I find really interesting, where they surveyed a large number of job seekers, and they found that 80% of candidates admit that they have considered misrepresenting the resume, and 60% say that, yes, I've done it in the past. So here I want to look at the most flagrant case of this skill inflation. So the job that we posted required proficiency in 3 skills: Python, React, and Node. And all the candidates that went through the AI interview were evaluated against those 3 skills. And they received grades from not experienced, junior, mid-level, experienced. So not experienced, based on my experience of taking this interviews, means that you have no familiarity whatsoever with this concept. So we will look at the numbers of resumes when someone says, I have an advanced proficiency in this skill, but what we actually find is that that person has kind of zero familiarity with it. So it turns out that there's 21% of people that misrepresented at least one skill in this way. And there's 8% of those applicants that misrepresented all 3. So this means that they wrote that I have advanced proficiency in Python, advanced proficiency in React, advanced proficiency in Node, while it turns out that they didn't have any familiarity with none of those concepts. So while the traditional recruiting pipeline will just consider what is written in the resume is true, an AI interviewer can spot those. Second is self-selection, or selection more broadly. So we had 26,000 candidates that were invited. 75% of them dropped out. Only 1 in 4 completed. So one channel here is selection on observables. Like we know that maybe people who are more familiar with the concepts will participate. Those who are less familiar will not. But there is probably a motivation component here. We don't observe who is more motivated here. But this is a time investment that you need to make in order to go through this AI interview. So we are probably screening for people who really want this job, or maybe have a lot of time. In terms of observable characteristics, we find that people who only have an undergraduate degree are more likely to complete the interview. People who have better resume scores are more likely to complete. Men are more likely to complete the AI interview than women, and also people with fewer years of professional experience. We have some ongoing RCT where we are trying to decompose this motivation component here as well. The last mechanism I want to talk about is how noisy those interviews are. And I really like this quote from Daniel Kahneman, so let me read it for you. The model does better in predicting the outcome than human. That is fundamental. It is telling you that one of the major limitations on human performance is not bias, it is just noise. In fact, most of the errors that people make are better viewed as random noise, and there is an awful lot of it. The way I want to go at this problem is to take some old historical data from this recruiting company where they have been simultaneously running 2 processes. Some positions they will be trying to fill in a conventional way. Some other jobs they would be already experimenting with the AI interviews. So we would then have 2 cases. We'll have cases in which a candidate applies, a recruiter selects who goes through a first stage human interview, and then we have a simultaneous process for different positions where recruiters select, and the first thing you're gonna first interview you're gonna take is an AI interview, and we have transcripts for both of those first stage interviews. We evaluate those transcripts in terms of their technical content, as well as conversational flow, and we do it using Claude, as well as some human raters. First thing that we see, perhaps surprisingly, is that the transcripts of interviews carried out by AI are rated higher on the conversational flow than by humans. And this is even when we remove different filler words, correct for grammar errors. So this was kind of a surprising result here. In contrast, when we look at the technical quality, so those 2 solid vertical lines, it doesn't look like AI is asking better technical questions than a human would. What we, however, find is that there is so much more variation in the quality of interviews conducted by humans than by AI. And I think this is very intuitive. An interview that happens in the morning maybe will be different than an interview that happens in the afternoon. There might be some, just who's vibing well with whom type of situations, where AI will be more consistent, right? It's going to be more similar experience that the candidate is going through. So to summarize, we find in our experiment that candidates who were selected by AI were 54% likely to pass an interview with a hiring manager as compared to 34% of those candidates selected through a traditional process. And in the paper, we do a little bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculations in order to figure out like how much time you can actually save as an organization if you do that. And this is actually substantial time saving at the company. And this probably explains why we see this is becoming more popular. However, there's a big but here, which is that just in our RCT, we had 5,600 candidates talking for 40 minutes with the AI bot. So this is in total 3,700 candidate hours. So this is almost half a year of conversations with this avatar. While in contrast, it has been just a few minutes to submit your resume if you go for a conventional process. So what happens here is the workload is shifted away from the employer onto the candidate. And this will have, if adopted, this will have profound implications on to how many jobs people apply for, how many candidates companies receive. So this is potentially a bad news. So to say something positive at the end, I think it's also a time where this is just being created and adopted, and in my view, there is a lot of opportunities to change this technology and improve. Two ways Ada and I are working towards is first to do a more adaptive interview length, where we think for some excellent candidates, probably within 5-10 minutes, you can just say you're great. And then we think that this is also an opportunity to receive, to give something back to the candidates in the form of personalized feedback. Thank you.
All right, amazing. Thanks, Emil. You can stay up here and grab a seat, and then we'll have Yav come back, and then I guess the three of us will chat for a bit, and then we'll open it up to a conversation with the rest of the room.
Oops.
All right.
Excuse me.
Great.
Chair, by the way. Definitely.
I guess like one question that came to mind in both of these talks is kind of, maybe this is an unfair question, but just thinking about future work. So I think, Yav, in your talk, you give a very good overview of all the work that you've done on switchbacks, but I imagine that there are many unanswered questions in switchbacks. So like what might some of those unanswered questions be? And then Emil, I was thinking in your work, I think you did a great job of highlighting the potential shifting of costs to candidates and things like that. I imagine there might be other sort of general equilibrium effects in terms of, like just what happens to the signal in the interviews as people adopt to AI interviewing, but then also we could somehow observe longer term outcomes beyond just passing the hiring manager phase. Like what do we learn about how well these people do when they're actually on the job? So those are two different questions, but both about, I think, looking a little bit further beyond the work that we have. And I guess I'm just curious what the two of you have been thinking about in terms of both of those questions.
You want to go first?
Sure. Yes, so the general equilibrium effects, I think this is definitely, it's a big technological change, and we'll see different practices emerge. So I think beyond the obvious change in behavior on the candidate side, I think this also emphasizes the importance of intermediaries in the markets like this, where you don't need to interview 10 times for software engineering position with 10 different employers. You could have a recruiting agency or kind of some type of intermediary that is collecting this and organizing the markets a little bit. We don't see it so much right now, and I think that would be kind of an excellent direction both for those firms to take, but also for us to figure out like how an effective intermediary like that could work, because that also kind of boils down into like how we should shape an interview when we know it's going to be used not only by one company but for more of them. So I think that's the main point on the general equilibrium. Now, I think going my experience also in this has been that everybody's trying to figure it out, and they are kind of winging it a little bit sometimes. And I think it's a nice opportunity for kind of broader academic community to first assess, see what's happening, what is positive about this, what's negative. But also there's a lot of openness in my experience to come there and try some alternative ideas.
Cool.
Great. Maybe just to build, so I didn't talk about this, but a big chunk of my work is also on actually the evaluation of AI and sort of running experiments with companies. And so we're seeing similar things in some of my projects where it's not on recruiting, but it's more sort of internal usage of it. And so there is this profound shift that's now happening. I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing it, where you're now not just sort of doing your own work, you're starting to use loads of different agents to go complete work on your behalf. And so if you sort of keep pushing this future of work where it's going, then it's not just you're also interviewing that person, but you're also actually interviewing maybe the agents that they can build and they can deploy. And so I think there's going to be a lot of just complete redesigns of a lot of these types of market, not just in recruiting, but more broadly. And then just sort of coming back to the switchback, oh my God, there's a ton of work. We've got a number of projects that are still happening. I think maybe just to call out one, which is, I think the biggest opportunity is to really use the granular level data. Like right now, you basically take all these drivers and you aggregate them, but actually you have a ton of information about exactly where each driver is, like how many people are trying to match with them, who actually ended up getting matched. So you have a ton of granular data, and so you can think about how can we actually effectively leverage this. It's not as simple as it sounds, because all of that data is actually outcome data because it's affected by prior treatments, and so you have to be really, really careful about how you incorporate it. So I think the direction of this area is just sort of using what some people call multi-resolution data. You have sort of the high-resolution data of this really, really granular things, but at the end of the day, you're still doing inference on the sort of on the less granular, the sort of the lower resolution data.
Yeah, totally. And I guess a bunch of your talk, you were talking about optimizing the design of switchbacks, and I guess Emil, I don't think you mentioned this in your talk, but I'm curious if you have any insight into for an AI interviewer, like the design of that tool, where I could imagine that there's quite a lot of optimization that could go into how should this work, what questions should it ask, what questions should it not ask. And I guess this is sort of previewing what we'll talk about in the fireside panel later on, but I think there's a lot of interesting questions around how we experiment on generative AI-based tools like this.
Yeah. Yes.
It's done. Full stop. Moving on.
Yeah, so just to highlight a few dimensions we looked at, and I'm sure there's more. So one thing I mentioned is just the length. Right now, it's everybody gets a 40 minutes experience. I think that for at least the positive cases, you can just say, once you reach some certainty threshold, that's probably enough. So that's a simple one. But then there's also a question of an actual content, right? Like, what is the question that the LLM should ask? I think in most principled way, I would think of this as some item response theory type of approach. But the way this is working today, it's nothing like this, right? We have an LLM that has a prompt and is being reprompted every time by another LLM when they see the response. So I think more theoretical sound approaches could be tested, and we could see whether this is how does this compare. There's also, of course, a question of bias and equity here, where I think one could worry whether how those LLMs actually behave. Definitely. There is, even like from my experience, there is even things like an accent that you have that can influence what type of questions you're going to be asked. So there is a tone there, and I don't think there's much work done so far.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I guess one additional question I had for you, is I think in your talk, so you talked a little bit about carryover effects in the beginning, and then I think you talked a lot about design in the second half. And I imagine there's some interaction of the two considerations, where if you do some of this re-randomization to, for instance, make sure that certain high demand or low demand times are both getting treatment allocation in the switchback design, you might end up dicing your time slots into more disjoint pieces so that you're more negatively affected by the carryovers.
Yes.
I guess, is that something that's already sort of optimized for in some of the re-randomization and covariate aware design schemes, or is that currently sort of
amazing question? I was hoping to skip over it because it's a very complicated area, which is, I said you have this really nice discrete version of time, but there's a question of where does that come from? How do you actually slice it? And depending on how you slice it, of course, will have implications on what are the carryover effects, their duration, etc. There is some work in that area. It's actually probably not as much as you would think. So I think that's a huge opportunity because, the cop-out answer that we say in half our papers is like, practitioners will know. It's like, really? Have you actually tried to do some of this stuff? You don't really know. And so, but there are some data-driven ways you could try to do it by basically looking at how long it takes for the dynamics to sort of stabilize, and that usually can be in a couple of hours. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense, but the designs definitely depend on those types of assumptions. And sort of the more accurate you can be, the better the improvement you would get from the sophisticated designs. What's nice about all of these is that even if you're completely wrong, it doesn't mean that you haven't invalidated the fact that you have a randomized experiment. It just means the benefits of doing a more sophisticated designs are not going to be as significant as you would have hoped for. So it's always valid, but basically, yes, if you figure out what are the duration, what is the right amount of time you should spend in it, that will really improve the overall quality of the design.
Got it.
Yeah.
PhD students in the room, take note.
Yeah.
Okay, so this feels like a good moment to open the floor to questions from the audience. So I think we hopefully have a couple of mic runners out in the room. If those mic runners could reveal themselves and go find some hands, that would be great.
Sure.
Well, maybe we don't have mic runners. All right, so it looks like Dean is coming around with two microphones. Yeah, first question over here.
Yeah, hey, my name is Matt Blackwell. I'm from Google. I had a question on the AI interviewing, which I think is a really neat project, and I was kind of wondering about these equilibrium effects on candidate behavior. Here, I'll stand up just so it's easier. And so at first is, if this is based on prompting, I'm just wondering about how much can candidates direct the interview themselves and move it to a situation where they would prefer, or jailbreak it in the more extreme case. That's one question. And then the second question is, are you worried about a more general effect where we move into the world where we do AI interviews and then candidates decide, well, I would just have my agent go and do the interview themselves because we have this step which is kind of they view as a procedural step that is weeding them out. So those are the kind of two questions I was interested in.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, maybe let me start with the second one. I do worry that this probably will happen. There are already startups that offer you products where they can, first scan your face and then make you look like you are responding to questions. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse type of situation. The company we work with, they have a proctoring score. So they require you to, record your screen, and you have to have a camera on. So they say that they are trying to detect it. I think it will be an arms race between the candidate and the recruiter. Regarding the second question, I think this is an excellent point. And I do think that some candidates are sophisticated enough that they recognize that this is an AI, so they will probably, for example, they're not going to feel awkward taking a very long pause where they can collect their thoughts and run some interview time. So I think the people will manipulate once they learn that they can.
take a moment to collect their thoughts. All right, we have another question over here.
Hi, this is a question for Iavor. I know you were focused in your talk on the global treatment effects, so you didn't talk about sort of other things, but I was curious, and that's why you see carryover effects as a source of bias, but I'm wondering sort of where do things lie in terms of looking at carryover effects in and of themselves as something interesting, sort of analogous to how spillover effects in networks are also seen as something interesting, because there can be something about a sequence of treatments that is interesting to look at. And sort of relatedly, the second part to my question is you also said, switchback experiments are really good when you want to avoid network interference. But then again, sort of spillover effects could also be interesting in terms of carryover through other units, right? In which case I can imagine that design will never tell you anything about the interaction of spillovers and carryover effects. So just wondering about sort of the state of the design analysis where you want to study that. Thanks.
Yeah, great questions, thank you. So we've definitely thought about it, and we have a much broader class of causal estimates you can look at. They look at the lag effects, they look at the short-term effects, they look at stepped versions of this. So there's a whole slew of these. I just focus on that one because it tends to be in practice the most popular one. And one of the ways we're using it right now for the lagged ones is to basically say, what if I ignored carryover effects? How strong do they actually need to be for me to actually change the decision that I would have made? And so there you do end up actually estimating the carryover effects and then using those to figure out, okay, if they're really large, they can actually switch the sign if I ignore them. So that's one thing. The second question is we've also thought a little bit about what happens when you have both network and carryover effects. The challenge with that is that everything just kind of blows up. If you think about the dependency structure, it's like, yes, the things that happen to me matter, then the things that are happening around me matter, and then also the things that happen to the people around me recently also matters. And suddenly, your potential outcomes becomes this crazy function of like so many things that you end up not being able to really, you can still estimate stuff, of course, but the variance is so large, and then you need to put conditions on basically like how quickly things are decaying so that you can still do non-trivial inference. So yeah, we have thought a little bit about it. Just if you allow for a lot of flexibility, things very quickly become intractable. Great questions, thank you.
All right, over here. Yep.
Thank you very much for your great talk. My name's Ling. I'm from MassMutual. So I think this is a question for Emil. You had mentioned that I'm so glad that you brought up equity, right? Because for employers, it's so important to ensure equal opportunity for employment and also limit our exposure to legal risks, right? So, and you also mentioned there's not a lot of done yet in this space. I'm just wondering what your plans are in terms of addressing some of these potential biases of large language models and also bringing more transparency in that process. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, this is definitely there hasn't been much done in this direction. One thing that we do find, which I think is quite telling, is that the probability to drop out from the interview is higher for women than for men, and the transparency could potentially help here, right? To inform ex ante that it's going to be an AI interviewer. This is how it works. So I think be transparent about this. So the gender component, the gender part is one here, but I think it's at least in the data we have here, the age factor plays a big role. Where the older people are much more likely to drop out from this type of experience. So I think part of this might be transient. Once this thing becomes the norm, maybe those gaps will decrease. So in the follow-up experiments, we are monitoring this and seeing, looking at those differential rates. The other part, which we have an ongoing project on right now, is to look at transcripts and just to try to figure out whether questions asked to older people and younger people are different. I think the accent and not being a native speaker is an interesting part. So we kind of explored the data here. I think we are not yet at the place of making any recommendations, but just like documenting what's happening.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I think I saw someone over here. Great.
Maurice Klaus from NBC Universal, and this question is about the switchback experiments. And I'm wondering, in the case of, let's say the driver example, is there a risk of, I don't know what to call it, maybe repeated exposure fatigue for a driver where they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out, and at some level they sense that they're in, and they like it. And this might be more of a problem when they really engage with the treatment. Then it goes away.
Yeah.
And maybe they opt out. Maybe they start driving for the other guys when they're out of the treatment and they're frustrated.
Yeah.
For example.
Absolutely. So typically, I would not recommend doing this in any of the user interface changes where it's like really visible to the participants that you're just messing around with their treatment and control. And so I would more prioritize doing these types of studies on sort of back-end changes and things that are, even if you're doing like matching algorithms, sure, that actually does affect the driver, but it's really hard to tell that that's happening. Because you're absolutely right, which is we all hate when we go into an app and if it just looks completely different. Let's be honest, right? Like, I know you're all running experiments all the time, but like, it's annoying if the user interface is changing every 2 weeks and you can't find what you're looking for. And so I think it's just you need to have the right balance there. And I think a lot of companies, and I would not recommend using this type of design on something that is very, very visible to the customer because of exactly the reason you said.
And the visibility part I get, but even if it's something that may just affect their day-to-day, it may be totally not right in their face, maybe something they just sense or something that, like maybe it's getting more, like if it's a driver, maybe they're getting more orders when they return. And like, oh, that's really cool. But they don't know, they don't see anything. It's just something that's happening to them.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think in some settings, that's actually good because you want to capture that. Right. That's basically telling you that the treatment is actually good. But that is basically a version of carryover effects that says, well, if I put you in control, when you come back, your treatment's actually your outcome's much higher because you left and sort of came back. And so again, that comes back to thinking really hard about what are the likely carryover effects and what are sort of the implications of that. And then designing experiments, either, if you made the duration maybe long enough so that you're swapping every 4 hours, then maybe that doesn't become as much of a problem. But if you're swapping every 10 minutes, it is. Yeah. So that was kind of David's point that I completely punted on and said it's a hard problem to solve.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, amazing. Thank you for the questions, and let's thank our speakers once again for these great talks.